Now we're going to dig more into this concept of samskaras. If we think about the Western term personality, in the East, the way that they understand this term personality is that it's a collection of samskaras. If we try to understand what our personality is, it's basically the way that we respond to particular situations. So if I start engaging in a romantic relationship, what kind of stuff automatically comes up and populates in my mind? If I'm dealing with a setback or a hardship, what are the automatic thoughts that my mind generates? Do I beat myself up for falling behind? Or do I sort of tell myself that I know I can do it and to continue persevering? And so a lot of what holds us back and propels us forward are our samskaras. So we're now going to start by sort of remembering what the pattern of a samskara is, and then we're going to go into more detail about the attributes of how samskaras work. And finally, we're going to touch a little bit about how to digest or dissolve negative samskaras, as well as implant or create positive ones. So let's start by remembering that essentially, our unconscious mind, or chitta, has a storehouse of all of these different samskaras. And the buddhi, or the intellect, is constantly scanning for the appropriate samskar given an appropriate environment. For example, if I have a phobia of dogs because I was bitten by a dog as a child, that samskar is not going to be active if I'm just, on the subway. But the second that the doors open and a dog walks onto the subway with their owner, suddenly the samskar activates. So my buddhi says, hey, we've seen this thing before. We know what this is. Let's call up the appropriate samskar. So now let's dig into the attributes of samskaras. The first thing to understand is that a samskar is kind of like a memory folder. And in that folder, there are a bunch of files which are your prior experiences that all share sort of a common thread. So in my mind, there's a dog folder. And in that dog folder are the collection of my experiences with dogs. So if I had, let's say, a dog that was on my street that chased me home from school every day when I was walking down that street, because that actually happened to me, what would happen is every day I would dread seeing the dog, and the dog would chase me, and I'd get more and more and more frightened each time. It was almost like a repeated trauma that then grew my phobia of dogs. So in the dog folder in my mind, in the dog samskar in my mind, is a memory of all these negative experiences. And then the next time I see a dog, my buddhi scans and brings all that negative emotional energy up. We also have positive samskars. So there are some folders in our mind which have like good memories, right? So later on, I actually got 3 German Shepherds. And so through my interactions with those German Shepherds, as I raised them from puppies and trained them myself, that folder in my mind sort of got populated with other kinds of files, positive memories. And so now it's super bizarre, but when I see a dog, I can actually feel both of the feelings. On the one hand, that's a really cool dog and I want to pet it, but I also simultaneously still feel to this day a little bit of fear. So the first thing to understand is that a samskar is a collection of experiences and undigested emotional energy that gets stored into our mind. The second attribute of samskars is that they retain the age at which they were formed. So when we have an experience in life and we lay down a particular memory, it actually retains the same sort of emotional age at which we had the experience. We may grow up, but that experience actually gets saved in our mind in its current form. And we understand this in psychiatry. There's a psychological defense mechanism called regression. And in regression, what happens is that someone who is under a period of stress will regress to a prior age. So sometimes you'll get adults who, when they're super stressed out, will start behaving like teenagers. Or you'll get teenagers or adults who, in particular circumstances, will start behaving like children. We'll sometimes get, a grown man or woman who throws a temper tantrum like a 6-year-old child. And so what's happening in that moment? Their samskar is actually activating and sort of transforming their mind into the same age at which the samskar was formed. So another way to kind of think about this is when you're a child, your mind has sort of a very rough way of understanding things and laying things down. It's almost like if I'm a 5-year-old and I draw a picture, that picture for the rest of time is not going to improve as I grow up. And oddly enough, our memory is the same way, because our memory is sort of drawing a picture of an experience. So when I'm a 5-year-old child, and let's say, unfortunately, my parents are getting divorced, I'm not going to sort of have a nuanced understanding of why they're getting divorced. My experience of that is going to be very, very rough and very, very patchy. Which is why when someone comes into my office in therapy, sometimes what we end up doing is sort of digesting that experience, re-examining that experience, and sort of bringing that experience from a primitive stage to a more sophisticated or mature stage, thereby sort of processing it with them. The next feature of samskaras is that while they may not seem logical from the outside, they actually have a fair degree of internal consistency. Because remember that when your mind is transported back to a previous point in time, in that point in time, sort of things worked a little bit differently. And this sort of explains why when I have a samskara that's active, friends of mine may tell me to not think like that. That's not actually real. It doesn't work that way. But when the samskara is active in my mind, it's like my mind is playing by a different set of rules. And it's this principle that causes samskaras to sometimes self-sabotage relationships. So a lot of the times that I see people kind of being held back or self-sabotaging in their own life, what I find is that there's a samskara at its root. And I'll give you guys just an example. So this is something I see a fair amount with my patients with borderline personality disorder, is that they have a fear of abandonment. So if they engage in a romantic relationship, what they start to do is become paranoid, and they'll ask their partner, "Are you going to abandon me? Are you going to abandon me?" And the partner's like, no, what do you, it's completely inappropriate for you to think that way. I'm totally committed to this relationship. I think you're awesome. Why are you worried about that? But the samskara sort of is still there and kind of populates thoughts in their conscious mind. And so they keep on asking, "Are you going to abandon me? Are you going to abandon me?" And sometimes benign things happen, like their partner forgets to turn on their cell phone, or the cell phone battery dies. And then the patient starts to think, "Oh my God, it's happening again, they're abandoning me." And then when they finally reach their partner, they're really, really upset with them. Sometimes they get really angry in sort of a defensive way. And eventually what happens is that fear of abandonment, which they really can't shake, starts to actually sabotage the relationship, and in dire circumstances can be too much for their partner to handle. And then what happens is the partner actually breaks up with them, and so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then in the mind of the patient with borderline personality disorder, the samskara actually gets reinforced. We actually add another file to the memory folder of romantic relationships result in abandonment. And then the next time they engage in a relationship, that samskara is even more powerful, and so results in even more self-sabotage. So we can see that our samskaras are sort of the combination of different ways that we respond to different scenarios. And this is in the West what we call the personality. So samskaras are kind of responsible for these ideas that I'm lazy, I'm undisciplined, I'm unlovable, I won't be able to be as good as this other person. And they're also responsible for positive things in our mind. So for example, people who are like cancer survivors who have withstood cancer and conquered cancer, oftentimes they're left with a really powerful positive samskara, which is that since I've conquered cancer, I can beat this too. Right? Some of us are very resilient, and most human beings actually are, and most of us actually have experiences that are positive, that sort of sunk in and sort of come up and populate our mind when things aren't going our way. So now let's talk a little bit about how do we get rid of or digest negative samskaras, and how do we create or implant positive ones. So it starts by recognizing what a samskara is. You have to be able to define and find the samskara before you start working with it. And this is done very simply by paying attention to your internal emotional state. You may find that there are particular times in life where you respond disproportionately to the situation, right? So for people who have abandonment issues, even though everything is going well, you may find that there's sort of this disproportionate fear of abandonment. So when that samskar activates, you'll feel probably some degree of negative emotion, and your mind may be relatively panicked. So the first thing to do is to notice it and say, oh wow, like this thing is happening again where I'm afraid that this person is going to abandon me. And so take a snapshot of that samskar. Take a really close look at it and try to understand what are all the features that I'm feeling. Okay, I'm feeling afraid, I'm feeling abandoned, I'm feeling ashamed. Physically, my stomach is kind of queasy. I feel like throwing up, I don't feel hungry. There can be mental sensations, physical sensations, and that's sort of how you find what the samskar looks like in the present. Now remember that this is emotional energy that's essentially carried over from the past, which means that there are going to be times in your life where you felt that same way. So the next step is to ask yourself, when have I felt this way before? And go back to different times in your life, and you may find that, oh, there have actually been a lot of times where I felt like someone was going to abandon me, and I felt queasy in my stomach. And if you're really careful, you may find some weird examples of when you felt that way. For example, after soccer practice, you were the last kid there, and your coach needed to leave. And so even though it wasn't a huge traumatic experience, you were wondering, is my mom or dad ever going to come pick me up? And you felt a little bit ashamed, you felt a little bit guilty, you felt a little bit queasy in your stomach. And so that's an instance of something being added to that folder of abandonment. And there could be other things. So in psychiatry and therapy, we train in some of these common issues like divorce early in childhood or traumatic experiences that can all lead to samskars. So the cool thing is that when you go back and you kind of re-examine those prior experiences, sometimes during that time, as you recall those memories, the feelings will actually return. So even as you remember what it was like to be the last kid on the soccer field, you'll start to feel a little bit queasy in your stomach. You'll start to feel a little bit of that guilt and that shame of being abandoned and the last kid there. And as you bring up that emotion, watch it. Because every time that you bring the emotion into the present and observe it and sort of process it, it actually melts away, and it's like you're deleting a file from your samskar folder. So the samskar gets a little bit weaker. And we see this in psychotherapy as well. So when I'm working with someone in psychotherapy, essentially what we do is we're talking about the past, and then they'll have this moment of like emotional catharsis where they start crying in my office. And they'll sort of feel all those feelings from the past when they felt abandoned. And it can be like a really intense emotional experience, but people always describe to me that they feel lighter, cleaner, less heavy afterward. And so therapy actually works by digesting samskars. And so the last thing to kind of consider is that there are many different ways to approach this. So you can do some kind of journaling to kind of recall these experiences. You can even do things like meditation retreats or even meditate on your own and kind of be mindful of this experience. You can really pay attention in the present as your samskars start to activate. And each time you notice a samskar, it gets a little bit digested. If you go back and kind of process things, it gets even more digested. The last thing that you can do is work with our coaches. So our coaches are really sort of trained in this paradigm, but you can absolutely work with a therapist as well. So there are lots of different ways to kind of approach digesting the samskar. The key thing, though, is that you have to feel the stuff in the present with awareness and then sort of let it go and metabolize it. Now we're going to move to where positive samskars come from, because a lot of people are often say to themselves, or when I tell them about samskars, they're like, how do I get to be resilient? When things don't go my way, my mind automatically calls me, undisciplined or lazy. How do I get my mind to tell me automatically, hey man, you can do it. Like, things aren't over yet. Give it your best and you'll be fine. So if we think about that, let's start by sort of understanding where positive samskars come from too. And just like negative samskars, they come from powerful emotional moments, right? So we sort of mentioned the cancer survivor, but I'd love to share a story from my own life. So when I was failing out of college and all that good stuff, I went to India and kind of learned yoga and meditation, came back to college, and it took me 3 more years to graduate. So I ended up graduating in a little over 5 years. And towards the end of graduation, I was dating my girlfriend at the time, and was really trying to figure out what to do. So I'd applied to 140 research positions and gotten rejected from all of them. And then I'd also applied to 40 medical schools and got rejected from all of them as well. And so I was super desperate and had no idea what to do. But I knew that there was this one lab at Harvard Medical School that sort of studied the neuroscience of like meditation, yoga, and Tai Chi. So I really wanted to go there and wanted to really get a job there. So I went to my girlfriend at the time and I said, you know, things aren't really going well for me. And I know it's going to be hard for our relationship. We were both in Austin, Texas at the time, but I really have to go to Boston. And what I was expecting in that moment is a lot of questions, right? Why do you have to go? What's your plan? Where are you going to stay? What are you going to do? Lots of questions that I'd had no answers to. And it was the sort of thing where I was sort of desperate and I really didn't have a good plan. And if she had asked a single one of those questions, you know, everything would have come crashing down because I really had no idea what I was going to do. And they were all super reasonable questions, like what's going to happen with our relationship? How often am I going to see you? But she actually didn't say any of those things. She just like looked at me and said, if you have to go, then go. And I was actually like blown away because here I was ready to, you know, get any degree of scrutiny, any degree of skepticism. But she was like, you do what you have to do. And I realized like here is someone who has faith in me, like who has faith in me when I really don't have faith in myself. And that kind of really sunk down deep into my mind. And I appreciated her so much for that. I didn't even realize at the time, but now, you know, I appreciate her so much for that. And the interesting thing is that like the way that she treated me in that moment stayed with me. And so the next year when I applied to medical school and I didn't get in, 40 more rejections, you know, there was a little voice in my mind that sort of came up and said, do what you have to do. And so every time that I was kind of faced with a problem, the same thing came into my mind, do what you have to do. Even when I finished training at Harvard Medical School and got an awesome job offer from, you know, my mentor who I respected so much, I realized that even though it sounded like an awesome idea that it was like such a great offer and anyone would kill for it, I realized that I had to do what I had to do. And I heard that samskar kind of come up and tell me that. And so positive samskars are implanted in our mind when, once again, our mind is very calm on the top. And in that moment, I'm totally focused, I'm totally vulnerable, I'm ready to get destroyed. And I hear the very opposite of what I was expecting. And that message, that faith sort of sinks in really, really deep and then starts to like populate my mind whenever I need it. So now people are probably wondering, how do I get that if I don't have such an amazing girlfriend? It's a completely reasonable question. And the cool thing is that these yogis in India actually discovered particular techniques to implant samskars into our mind. Because if we look at the circumstance of that conversation, my mind was primed in a particular way to let something sink in. So there's a particular practice called yoga nidra, which we're going to teach you. So yoga nidra is the practice of sequentially calming your mind. And when your mind is very, very, very calm, you take a sankalpa, a resolve, and you kind of plant it deep into your unconscious. And then whenever you need it, that sankalpa, that resolve, that positive samskar will kind of come up and fill your mind with sort of positivity and resilience. So let's kind of recap, okay? I know we've covered a lot. So the first thing is that samskars are a really, really important part of understanding who we are. In the West, when we use the word personality, in the East, they view that as a collection of our samskars. Practically, a samskar is the automatic programming that we have that arises in a given situation. And our buddhi, or intellect, is always scanning for which samskar is appropriate. Samskars retain the age at which they were formed, and also are basically balls of undigested emotion that linger in our unconscious mind. A lot of times the things that hold us back, or a lot of times the things that self-sabotage our life, are actually these samskars. So you can digest them through a dedicated process of observing what the samskar is, really tracking it down and discovering its origins. And as you discover its origins, you'll chip away at that emotional energy. The other cool thing is if you notice the activity of the samskar in your present, if you say to yourself, oh, I'm not actually in trouble here, this is just my samskar of abandonment activating and telling me I'm in trouble. That also weakens the samskar and gives you power over it. And lastly, there are positive samskars that can give us a sense of resilience and hope and strength. And those can be formed naturally throughout life, but can actually be cultivated through particular yogic practices like yoga nidra. So I hope this has been helpful, and we also have other parts of the module that may be a little bit more helpful in sort of understanding more about samskars. So part of the problem is that I think this actually normally is like over here. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it's not really that part. It's the front that keeps kind of falling.